You might say, why would Bernadette want to come back from pretty Bartray out in the countryside helping with the sheep and the pigs, etc. on the farm? But she knew deep inside, and she was a tough and sensible little girl, that her education had come to a complete halt. She wasn't going to school at all out there, and that her catechism had come to a complete halt, and she wouldn't be able to make her first communion unless she returned to the squalor of the Cachot. And so in January 1858, when Bernadette had just become 14, she returned, as far as she was concerned, happily to the squalor of the Cachot so that she could continue with her education. Maybe that was fortunate, but certainly it was a month later when the apparition, the first apparition, took place, which set off the sensation which is modern Lourdes. Let me just tell you a little bit about how that first apparition took place. They had no firewood, as usual. They were short of food, as usual. So Bernadette's mother said to Bernadette and her sister and another friend who lived nearby, "Why don't you go down to the River Garve and collect some of the driftwood that collects up down there? That will at least enable us to have a nice warm fire." But she warned Bernadette under no circumstances to cross the Savy stream, which would be icy cold, and with Bernadette's asthma attacks, etc., that would be dangerous. When they got down to the little stream and her two friends crossed it, screaming out as they did so how cold it was, Bernadette dutifully remained behind. And as she sat there on a little rock, just waiting patiently for the other girls to return, that was the moment when she suddenly saw a beautiful lady, beautiful young lady, in a little niche, a little cleft in the rock of Massabielle. The lady didn't say anything, Bernadette didn't say anything, but some instinct made her take out her rosary. That was the first apparition. And after that, Bernadette went back to Lourdes and started telling people about what she had seen, not what she had heard, because the lady hadn't spoken. And so that set in train all of the other apparitions, which I don't propose to tell you about, because the point of this story is to tell you about Bernadette and to tell you the story of Lourdes only from her point of view. However, I would like to say that the lady did say to Bernadette in later apparitions, "Let us have a chapel built here, let processions come here," and she frequently spoke to Bernadette about the importance of praying for sinners and about the importance of repentance. There's just one other thing I'd like to tell you about what the lady said to Bernadette. On one of the apparitions, I think it was the third, she said to her, "I do not promise to make you happy in this world, but in the next." It was to prove only too true, that statement, as you shall hear in the later part of the story. When Bernadette got back from that first apparition and told her parents what she had seen, they didn't believe her. Indeed, her mother said she was not to go back to that part of Lourdes, what we now call the grotto. The authorities got to hear about what Bernadette claimed she had seen, and they didn't like it either. And they liked it still less when Bernadette went down 2 or 3 or 4 more times and had further experiences, apparitions, down at the grotto. However, the people began to believe in what Bernadette was saying. Meanwhile, the authorities interviewed Bernadette very roughly and harshly. They interrogated her, and their conclusion was that she was nothing more than an attention seeker and a troublemaker, and she needed to be told to stop going down to the grotto. But the impulse that Bernadette had to go down for the apparitions was so great that she did indeed, sometimes almost early in the morning, go down to the grotto. As I say, the people began to believe in her, but because the civil authorities considered that Bernadette was causing a disturbance and a commotion, particularly when more and more people gathered with Bernadette while she was seeing her lady down at the grotto, decided by the time of the last apparition that the grotto should be barricaded up. Indeed, for the last apparition, the 18th, Bernadette couldn't go down to the grotto. She had to cross the River Garve and see Her Lady from the opposite side of the Garve through and across the barricades. However, on the 9th apparition, a spring was discovered. Bernadette discovered it, but only at the behest of Her Lady, who pointed out a little sort of mud pool, which Bernadette scrabbled around in, and out burst this spring, which we now know became a miraculous spring. And indeed, at the time, the people of Lourdes, believing in Bernadette, would take their children down there who were ill with some disease or other, and miraculous cures were already being encountered in those early days. So Bernadette's credibility positively soared. Indeed, the whole district around Lourdes got to know about the Lourdes story, and bit by bit the story filtered through all of the way to Paris. The Emperor Napoleon III heard about it, and he found it to be a credible story. And he didn't like the idea that the barricades were up, stopping the people from visiting this place. And he ordered personally in October 1858, so that's just 8 months or so after the apparitions, that the barricades should be removed. So with Bernadette's credibility growing and growing, the people of the town, the civil authorities of the town, decided that it wasn't good enough, quite properly, that the poor Soubirous family should continue living in that dreadful hovel called the Cachot. So they found another mill called the Gras Mill for the Soubirous family to move into. They rented it, of course, but this time the rent was modest and convenient, and the family was able once more to be back to normal times. It was a bit like going back to the old Bowley Mill where Bernadette had been so happy. But it wasn't quite the same story for Bernadette, because she was now becoming famous, and the civil authorities, in consultation with Bernadette's parents, decided that Bernadette should be sent as a day girl to the local convent. This was a fee-paying institution, but Bernadette was put in the paupers class. No fees had to be paid for her. But although that was slightly humiliating, what was even more humiliating was that Bernadette, aged 14, who couldn't read, who couldn't write, who'd only just made her first communion, was put with a class of girls aged 7 years old. You can imagine how humiliating that was for little Bernadette to be put into such a low-level class. But that was the story of her life.